me ask you, how many of you experienced Hurricane Agnes? Let me see a show of hands. Okay. How many, keep your hands up if you experienced it in Virginia. Okay, and keep your hands up if you experienced it in Prince William County. Okay, there are a handful of these folks. Okay, good, thank you very much for that. So, my PhD in history from Georgetown, my dissertation was on Morocco in the early Atlantic world, so 15th and 16th centuries, okay? So one of the advantages of writing about a subject like that is that there is nobody alive today from that time who can be pissed off about what you say about the event, right? That is not the case when you're writing local history of the modern period. So I always like to know who is in my audience, and so you four I will be paying special attention to. So my talk today is derived from my book, Hurricane Agnes in Virginia, which comes out April 1, as Yolanda said, from the History Press, and I was able to secure some copies early, which if you are interested, will be for sale out there in the break. Please don't feel pressured or obligated, but I will say all the proceeds benefit the Occoquan Historical Society. That's actually the staff member out there from the Historical Society who's selling them. You'll see on the back of the book, Agnes was described as the greatest natural disaster of all time. Now the publisher put that up there, folks, on the back of the book. The actual quote is the greatest disaster of all time in dollar terms. Okay, and I pointed this out to the publisher, and they said, yeah, we know, you explained it in the book, so this sounds better on the back cover. So, you know, I also said as a historian, you know, when it was in Virginia, it wasn't a hurricane. In fact, it was only a hurricane for a very, very limited time south of Florida. They said, yeah, well, we're not entitling it Tropical Depression Agnes in Virginia or anything like that. It's Hurricane Agnes. You can talk about that in the book. So, for the purposes of today, I will focus more on Northern Virginia, but the book, in fact, does cover the entire state. In fact, I discussed more than 75 different Virginia communities. Northern Virginia was, however, one of the hardest hit in the state, along with Richmond, and so it's covered prominently in the book. Now, in the first chapter of the book, I try to provide some context by talking about the science and history and science of hurricanes. We won't do that today, but I will mention a couple of things that are in that first chapter just to set the stage a little bit. While sometimes experiencing strong storms at sea, Europeans were essentially unaware of hurricanes until they crossed the Atlantic into the Western Hemisphere. In fact, it was Christopher Columbus in 1502 who was the first European to experience a hurricane. And these hurricanes were things that were described to him by the Arawakan language speakers of the Caribbean. And they were named after their storm god and called Hurricane. And that's where the name comes from. This particular painting is from 1594. It's entitled A Terrible and Unprecedented Storm. It's often mislabeled, and you'll see this in some other sources. It's often mislabeled as the wreck of the Santa Maria. Now, despite continuing to experience the devastation of hurricanes for nearly 250 years, Europeans really did not make much progress in their understanding of hurricanes over that period. It really wasn't until starting in about the 1740s that we started to get a grasp of exactly how hurricanes work. And over a period of about 125 years, so taking us to what I would characterize as the later decades of the 19th century, so the later 1800s, we really figured out completely how hurricanes work. I talk about this in some detail in the book. We won't talk about it in detail here, but basically hurricanes are the most powerful type of cyclogenic storm, known as a tropical cyclone. And there have to be numerous conditions for these to form, but the number one condition is that you have to have surface ocean temperatures of 80 degrees or more. So that surface layer of the ocean, which extends about 50 meters, has to have a temperature of 80 degrees or more. What it does is it basically causes that moist air, heated moist air above it to rise, rises up into the atmosphere, reaches a certain level, cools, condenses, drops as rain. As that air is rising, of course, it creates a vacuum underneath it, other air rushes in, some other conditions, including the Earth's circulation, contribute to creating these tremendous winds that we associate with hurricanes. The real engine, though, the real fuel of a hurricane is the warm ocean water. And that's why you typically do not see hurricanes on the west coast of the United States, okay? Along with the prevailing winds and the cold water there. If you've ever gone swimming in San Diego or Los Angeles, you know that water is a lot colder than it is on the Atlantic coast. And as a result, you typically do not get hurricanes on the American West Coast. Now, as I was doing some of the final edits on this book in the fall, of course, what happened? Hurricane Otis slams into northwestern Mexico and drops rain all over California. And so with global warming, with climate change, we probably are going to see more hurricanes on the West Coast. But for the most part, when it comes to the continental United States, they strictly hit the East Coast. And they really come from two different areas. One is in the Eastern Atlantic, right off the west coast of Africa. Typically what happens there is moist air from the Indian Ocean or from the Gulf of Guinea is heated by the Sahara Desert, generates these thunderstorms. Now during hurricane season, June 1 to November 30th, this happens like every 3 to 4 days, okay? Generates these thunderstorms. Now most of these peter out as the winds carry them west. But if they get by the Cape Verde Islands and transform into hurricanes, they become known as Cape Verde hurricanes. And they constitute about 60% of all hurricanes and about 85% of all the major ones. Now the other hurricanes that we experience on the East Coast, the rest of them, move from south to north, and they originate in the Caribbean and either hit the American Gulf Coast or Florida, or they travel up the American eastern coast. An average hurricane generates the energy equivalent of 1/2 of the world's total electrical generating capacity. And think about that for a moment, and that is all powered by essentially warm ocean water. That is also why hurricanes typically dissipate very quickly when they hit land, because once you hit land, you have the cooler land temperatures and you rob the hurricane of its fuel. Now what's happened to us, however, is when we experience hurricanes in areas like this, we don't experience them on the coast, right, for the most part. So we're not really facing the substantial winds that hit places like Florida. When we experience hurricanes, places like this, what really causes the damage is the rainfall and the flooding. And that's, of course, what happened with Agnes. Now, I said that by the end of the 19th century, basically, we had mastered how hurricanes work. What we hadn't mastered was how to predict them and how to respond. In 1870, President Ulysses S. Grant established what was ultimately to become the National Weather Service, but frankly, the technology wasn't really up to snuff in terms of predicting hurricanes. In fact, in 1900, the deadliest hurricane ever to strike the United States occurred in Galveston, Texas. More than perhaps 10,000 people were killed in that hurricane, and it remains the deadliest natural disaster in U.S. history. After that, the New Deal, of course, under Franklin Roosevelt, cast a very critical eye on what was then the National Weather Bureau, forced an upgrade, both in personnel, methodologies, communications, and technological infrastructure. And in fact, so confident was the Weather Bureau about these changes that in 1935, July of 1935, they embarked on a national advertising blitz, where they put up ads like this in papers around the country. This was actually unearthed for me by a librarian at the Library of Congress from the Honolulu Advertiser. And you see this advertisement, it's made to look like it's a legit news article, right? You even see up here, let me see if I can work the pointer. Yeah, you even see up here, they make this sort of fake byline, like it's an actual news article. I'll read you a little bit of it. It says, quote, "Hurricanes that roar in from the Caribbean and smite with demon fury, carrying death and destruction, are going to find it tough going from now on. Uncle Sam has perfected his hurricane service, perfected it to the extent of putting a decided crimp in their stealthy approach." It was a bold and confident statement. It's also decidedly premature. A little over a month later, the Labor Day hurricane of 1935 struck the Florida Keys, killing hundreds of World War I veterans who were living in shacks as they worked on a road to the bankrupt municipality of Key West. It would actually take World War II and the Cold War and the technological advances that they spurred for us to develop things like Hurricane Hunter aircraft and satellites that would improve our predictive power. In the meantime, other steps were taken as well. Up to the 20th century, essentially natural disasters, the response to natural disasters was handled by charities, by charitable organizations. But then President Theodore Roosevelt and Calvin Coolidge, on an ad hoc basis, actually involved the federal government in disaster relief responses. And this resulted in an increasing expectation on the part of the public that the federal government would get involved in responding to the damage from natural disasters. In 1950, Harry Truman signed the Disaster Relief Act, which authorized aid to supplement state and local responses to disasters. The result was that the public, even more, increasingly began to expect that the federal government would provide disaster relief. Now, in part to address this, in 1968, Congress passed the National Flood Insurance Program, and its purpose was to use premiums from those in flood-prone areas to fund an insurance program so that the federal government was not bailing out those who built in flood-prone areas. That, of course, as you probably all know, hasn't really worked out that way. Okay, now just a few years before Agnes arrived in Virginia, part of the state was hit by Camille. Does any of you remember Camille at all? Okay, so Camille really hammered Nelson County in particular, which I've highlighted there in yellow. It was one of only 4 of what we would now characterize as Category 5 storms to hit the United States. As it approached Virginia through Kentucky, it was thought to have blown itself out, but in a tragic preview of Agnes, it was strengthened by other weather features. The result was massive rainfall on the night of August 19th and 20th, particularly in Nelson County. Everyone was caught by surprise. More than 120 people were killed, 37 were never found. Multiple generations of families were wiped out. Nelson County alone was estimated to experience 3,800 landslides and measured 28 inches of rainfall over 8 hours. And that rainfall amount was an amount that a Weather Bureau study of a little over a decade before had calculated as, quote, the maximum rainfall possible, end quote, in an area. Camille remains the worst storm ever to strike Virginia and brings us to within a few years of Agnes. Now, when I was researching Agnes, it's important to remember, I think, as historians, that essentially what we do is we impose a narrative on events that people are experiencing with hindsight, of course, right? And in other words, when you're actually experiencing the event, you're really not in a position to see things outside your line of sight. So you don't know about other factors. You don't know about potential alternatives. You don't know what's going on in other areas. With hindsight, of course, historians try to make sense of all this stuff by imposing basically what is an artificial narrative, in the sense that for the people who were living it at the time, it was impossible for them to construct such a narrative or to think in such terms. So to try to get a sense of that, of course, I used a variety of different sources. Now, amongst the archival primary sources are things like these are the minute-by-minute accounts of the State Civil Defense Office Emergency Operations Center. This was activated at a certain time, continued until after the hurricane, and this transcribes reports and other things that are coming in to the emergency operations staff and what they are doing in response. I also used a number of things to get a sense of what people were experiencing at the time in different areas. I used something that we really don't have much of anymore, which are these things over here. These are smaller local newspapers, and these carry a great deal of valuable information. Of course, I had a bunch of different other government reports and things like that, some from right after the event, some were observations during the event, some were many years later. Now, one of the things I'll say about this is, though looking at these records could never match the direct experience, reading them actually provides some sense of the alarm and confusion that must have surrounded Agnes's arrival. Because while fundamentally I will say they are accurate and illuminating, inevitably perhaps, they are at times inconsistent or contradictory. They lack context, they misidentify individuals or locations, and they contain confusing typographical errors. Like the event itself, they reflect only a partial grasp of the situation at any given time, and one limited to the field of view of the particular observer. Through them, I think we thus get a glimpse, however modest, of just how the event might have felt in real time in terms of the confusion and alarm. And I will tell you in the book, I did my best to reconcile these various differing accounts, and in many places, whether directly in the text or in the footnotes, I'll explain the conclusions I came to, or identify some of the items that are clearly mistaken in some of the reports and other documents. Now, one of the things Camille exposed was that the Virginia civil defense apparatus was not sufficient to respond to natural disasters. Now, imagine this. Imagine you're a civil defense volunteer in Nelson County. Now, what you have to do is you have to drive or walk out to a river gauge, okay, a river gauge you're going to read manually. You have to read that thing, you have to get back to location, find a phone, from that phone, call this into central headquarters, where it's then consolidated with other data. Now imagine you're doing that at midnight on August 19th when it's pouring rain in Nelson County and the roads are getting washed away by the floodwaters, the gauges are overflowing, and the telephone lines are all knocked down. That's essentially what happened during Camille. Now couple that with the fact that up to that point, the civil defense apparatus at both the federal and state levels was really focused on the threat of nuclear attacks, not on natural disasters. And in fact, as we'll find, as the threat of nuclear war receded, the civil defense apparatus basically stagnated. It was really not geared to handle natural disasters. And it took some time for this focus to change. Mills Godwin was the governor during Camille and was succeeded in 1970 by Linwood Holton, who was determined that Virginia would be better prepared to tackle natural disasters. In March of 1972, his administration published the Commonwealth of Virginia Natural Disaster Assistance Relief Plan. It was distributed to most local civil defense officials about a week or two before Agnes arrived, and it would be sorely tested. Now, 1972 was a relatively mild meteorological year in the Atlantic with only 4 storms warranting naming and only 3 of them reaching hurricane status. The hardest hit by Agnes, as many of you probably know, was Pennsylvania. In fact, I originally submitted my book proposal to do a book on all of Agnes. The editorial board, after a couple of weeks, came back and said, look, you know, Pennsylvania has been really covered thoroughly because of how hard it was hit, but Virginia the experience in Virginia has been relatively underreported. Would you mind focusing on Virginia? So of course, I agreed to. Now, one of the advances after Camille was that the National Weather Service asked to have access to the country's ATS satellite sites. And so Hurricane Agnes was one of the first to be actually tracked in that fashion by the National Weather Bureau. It began to form in the Caribbean, near Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula on June 14, 1972, reached hurricane status on June 18th, and then only for a very brief time as what we would consider one of the weakest types of hurricanes, what we would now characterize as a Category 1 hurricane. It came ashore in the Florida Panhandle on June 19th. It was so weak, in fact, that some of these jurisdictions that were evacuated, it's really fascinating to read some of these local newspaper accounts, Fort Walton Playground News, for example. Some of these communities sued the federal government after Hurricane Agnes came through because they had evacuated, and Agnes came through and they felt this was no different than just a regular winter storm. So some of these communities actually sued because they thought the damage would be a lot greater and they lost a lot of economic revenue because they had evacuated the town. Well, it came ashore in Florida on June 19th, flooded some low-lying areas, spawns of hurricanes, and caused some deaths and flooding in both Cuba and Florida. But Agnes no longer even qualified as a tropical storm as it passed into Georgia, where it was greeted with relief and was characterized by a spokesperson for the Georgia Farm Bureau as, quote, a lifesaver, unquote, as it passed benignly across the state with soaking rains that averted a drought-induced crop failure. In fact, 3 counties in Georgia had just a week earlier applied for emergency relief because of the extreme drought Georgia was facing. But as things changed, things changed as Agnes moved northward into the Carolinas, whereas was the case with Camille, weather systems to the east and west manipulated and supplemented Agnes so that as it moved off the southeast Virginia coast, it regained almost its maximum former strength. What really was damaging about Agnes was the tremendous amount of moisture that it carried. And it had this incredibly large circulation envelope, meaning you can imagine what I'm talking about when I say circulation envelope. No offense. Anyway, it's this. That was up to 1,000 nautical miles in diameter at times. So when we got hit with Agnes in Virginia, Agnes was actually off the southeast Virginia coast, moving northward to New York. Excuse me. Now, I'm going to tell you in the second chapter of the book, I talk about the physiography of Virginia, a decent amount about the various communities that I'm going to be talking about in the book, why they were located, where they were, their history, the sort of things that they were concerned about, the weeks and months, and in some cases just even a few days, before Agnes arrived. Agnes, of course, then being, of course, unaware of Agnes. Now, I expressed some reservations about this chapter to Charlie Grimes months ago when I was talking about the physiography of the region. And I have to tell you that my 82-year-old mother has read the book and has laid down the definitive interpretation that the second chapter is extremely boring, and she plans to use it now whenever she has trouble sleeping. She's going to read that chapter again. So she is adamant that it is worth skipping. I will admit it is a little turgid, and there are some areas where I don't handle the transitions particularly well, but it does have what I think is some valuable information. Now, I said, well, you know, Mom, I don't know if they're going to talk about that. She says, well, now we'll tell them that if they get through chapter 2, it's smooth sailing after. Anyway. So, now, as Agnes approached Virginia, more southern communities like Danville on the North Carolina border, Pulaski and Roanoke, Salem in the southwest, Farmville on the Appomattox, places along the James like Scottsville were hit on June 21. This is a photograph from Farmville. Nelson County was also hit, but the lessons of Camille had been learned there, and first responder personnel found that when they went to evacuate people in Nelson County were already gone. They knew from their experience what they should do. In fact, although the new state disaster relief plans had only been issued a few weeks before, and there was thus no real time to do any training, many communities were much better prepared than during Camille, and benefited from the fact that Agnes did most of her damage during daylight hours, rather than being a nighttime surprise the way Camille was. So think about this for a moment. We're talking about June 21. That's the summer solstice, the longest day of the year. So Agnes is hitting during the daylight, mostly during the daylight hours. Now, unfortunately, one area, however, that had not experienced Camille and did not appear to be as well prepared was Northern Virginia. The first information on Prince William County came into Civil Defense headquarters in Richmond a little after 7 p.m. with a report that floodwaters had broken a small dam near Bull Run Mountain, possibly resulting in one death. Unfortunately, this proved to be true as authorities later identified the body of Lorenza Harris, 29, of Haymarket, who died when an earthen dam in the Jackson Hollow Recreation Area gave way. Within another hour, it was reported that the town of Manassas, remember at the time Manassas was a town, not a city, had lost power, and that flooding was occurring in Prince William. Now, at the Prince William County National Guard Armory in Manassas, officers were meeting on the evening of June 21 to finalize plans for the upcoming annual Guard Camp when they received a call from the county police asking for assistance to evacuate some Girl Scouts from Connecticut who were in Prince William Forest Park. This was to be a source of some after-action criticism of Guard personnel because the Guard officer in charge responded that they did not have the authority to participate in rescue operations. The Girl Scouts, in fact, eventually abandoned their tents as water rose and they took refuge at the Dumfries Triangle Fire Station Social Hall. The Guard officer, though, did, in a humanitarian gesture, exceed his authority and opened the armory for refugees, and by 11 p.m. reported that about 30 people were under their care. The armory, however, was not prepared to serve as a shelter, and soon after opening, the power went out due to Agnes. With an electric-powered water pump, the power outage left the armory with no water for drinking or sanitary needs. As more people arrived, the guardsmen worked by flashlight and gas lanterns, but it soon became apparent that they needed food and blankets for the arriving refugees. A request for bedding, food, and medical care arrived at State Civil Defense Headquarters at 11:29 p.m. A minute later, the last report to Civil Defense Headquarters for June 21st arrived. It simply but ominously stated, quote, Town of Occoquan was evacuated into Manassas with the Red Cross to follow up in the morning. Now that's one of those reports that actually wasn't quite accurate, wasn't correct. The town was not evacuated to Manassas, but rather to the Botts Fire Station in Woodbridge, where the Salvation Army and the Ladies Auxiliary of OWL registered them, set up bunks, and provided donated food, baby's milk, and games. As one assistant fire chief reportedly remarked, although not planned that way, the fire station, quote, had become the disaster headquarters for eastern Prince William County, unquote. This family still lives in Occoquan today. Over in that photograph is the late Vernon Dawson, who used to be the county supervisor for the Occoquan district. As time wore on, the crowd became too large and refugees were housed in Masonic Lodge and area churches, while OWL personnel responded to calls from elsewhere. Now, what initially caused problems in Occoquan on June 21 was not the Occoquan River, but the flooding from tributary streams like Bailey Whack Creek. Any of you folks live in the Lake Ridge area? Okay, sorry, about what I'm going to say. Okay, so Occoquan residents had actually been complaining for some time that this flooding was being caused by upland development in Lake Ridge. When Agnes arrived, quote, torrents, unquote, of water flooded through the streets from nearby hills, and the level of the river began to rise. As conditions worsened, town residents heard a knock at their door that, when answered, revealed a firefighter telling them it was time to leave immediately. Then, shortly after midnight, 12:18 a.m. on June 22nd, this is now from a report coming into Civil Defense Headquarters Emergency Operations Center in Richmond. The National Guard reported that the Occoquan Dam might break. To make matters worse, less than 15 minutes later, an ambiguous report arrived at the State Civil Defense Emergency Operations Center from the state police. Although I-95 was reported open to DC, there was mention of a problem of a barge against a bridge somewhere along I-95. That's a quote. Quote, mention of a problem of a barge against a bridge somewhere along I-95, end quote. Just before 1 a.m., the state police reported the closure of I-95 and US Route 1 in Prince William. Now, from subsequent reports, it does not appear that the dam was truly in danger of breaking, so it's not really clear where this claim originated, but it circulated widely and caused a great deal of alarm. And I talk about this in several places in the book, this problem, and this illustrates a problem that occurred throughout the state during Agnes. Information arrived at the State Emergency Operations Center that was reported in the press that simply was not accurate. Anecdotal reports would present a recurring challenge to civil defense personnel, both from civilian personnel as well as from their own personnel. Observations of private citizens, for example, on the scene, if accurate, could provide invaluable life-saving information. If not accurate or exaggerated, however, they could lead to a misallocation of resources that might have deadly consequences. Throughout the disaster, civil defense personnel had to determine the reliability of such information and make quick decisions in real time. If you do end up purchasing the book, you will see there are a number of instances, for example, where the Civil Air Patrol is doing a fantastic job, but of course they're observing things from airplanes. So periodically, they're reporting things that when investigators on the ground get there, they find, frankly, are not true at all. So this was a recurring problem. Now, one can understand the concern about the Occoquan Dam. It has never had flood control capacity. At the time, it was 55 feet high and had a spillway on the north end, but it had no ability to regulate floodwaters. And that is still true today. It has never had the type of sluice gates that can regulate floodwaters. That does not mean, on days like today, people in Occoquan won't call the mayor of Occoquan and say, hey, has Fairfax Water opened the sluice gates on the dam? There are no flood control sluice gates on that dam, okay? One thing that was true about those early reports in the very early moments of June 22nd was that a barge had indeed come loose. Chief Tommy Furr of OWL had been involved in aiding 3 men who had ignored a roadblock on Route 1. He tied himself to some other firefighters and waded in the waters to perform the rescue. Now, according to reports, he happened to be in Occoquan when he witnessed a barge from the old Vulcan Materials site break loose, crash into a large boat, and dock, and then continue downstream. Worried about it damaging the I-95 bridge, he sent a team down to close off the interstate. They were on the bridge when the barge struck, generating, quote, a tremendous thump, unquote, and causing the pillars of the bridge to vibrate. A press account later characterized the bridge as, quote, tilting precariously, unquote, and another claimed authority said the bridge was, quote, damaged significantly and may go out, end quote. However, though closed until about 5 p.m. that day, the I-95 bridge did not give out. However, almost a month later, on July 19th, part of the Route 1 bridge across the Occoquan collapsed due to damage from Agnes. And there's a photograph of that there. While both spans were then closed for inspection, it caused what was described as the worst traffic jam in the area's history. So this is basically a month later, damage from Agnes causes the Route 1 span to collapse. Now, in the meantime, things were not going well in other parts of Northern Virginia. Along a problem area, as early as 8:05 p.m. on June 21st, authorities ordered the evacuation of some 1,000 people from the Arlandria section of Alexandria, adjacent to 4 Mile Run. A little more than an hour later, 4 Mile Run reached its 10-foot flood stage, rising at the rate of an inch a minute. It tore through Arlandria, while on the southwestern side of Alexandria, Holmes Run also exceeded its bank. And by 10:15 p.m., cars floated down both waterways. At 11 p.m., a fire broke out at the Beverly Plaza Shopping Center on Mount Vernon Avenue. Floodwaters were 8 feet deep, so the firefighters couldn't reach the stores, and 6 of them burned to the waterline. Additionally, the Occoquan Dam was not the only one in Northern Virginia that worried officials. Near Bailey's Crossroads in Fairfax County, the damming of Holmes Run had created Lake Barcroft. As water levels rose and began coming over the dam, officials evacuated 80 homes, and within an hour of the evacuation order, the water had eroded the earth on the west end of the concrete dam, and the lake began pouring into the valley below. The Army Corps of Engineers dispatched men to sandbag and reinforce the dam, and by about 2 a.m., enough water had come out of the lake for the danger to have passed. Now, that's about 2 a.m. in the morning on June 22nd. By 3 a.m. on June 22nd, reports began to arrive in Richmond that painted a fuller picture of what was happening in Prince William County. Routes 234, 18, 15, and 66 were all closed, and a reported 1,600 people were refugees sheltered in schools, fire stations, and the National Guard Armory. Among those displaced were people that Bull Run had flooded out of the 140-unit Bull Run trailer park near Route 28, with some mobile homes being swept away in the process. Floodwaters from Bull Run and other tributaries inundated the Westgate, Sudley, and Yorkshire subdivisions south of the river above the town of Manassas Park. In one incident, 3 women fled to a phone booth lodged against a pole, hoping to avoid being swept away by the floodwaters. They actually had to stand on their toes in the phone booth as the water continued to come into the phone booth to keep their heads above the water, until they were rescued by members of the Stonewall Jackson Fire Department, who arrived in a 14-foot motorboat. Despite the heroism of all the first responders, response activities in western Prince William appeared to be less well coordinated than elsewhere, not only elsewhere in Prince William, but elsewhere in the state. When asked who was coordinating rescue operations, one fire department leader reportedly responded, quote, "Unfortunately, no one. We're all doing the best we can." Now, a little before 10:30 a.m. on June 22nd, Virginia Governor Linwood Holton made a damage assessment survey of the state by helicopter. Conditions in the western part of Prince William County were particularly shocking. Bull Run, which residents describe as normally 20 feet wide and inches deep, had risen 3 feet in an hour, and with nearby Cub Run, had proceeded to bury the neighborhoods of Sudley, Westgate, Loch Lomond, and Yorkshire. Boats were tied up to second-story windows, and debris was everywhere. The sight of the devastation from the air was so bad, in fact, that it prompted the governor to make an unscheduled stop. He and his team disembarked near an elementary school, and as they disembarked, a man approached pleading for help, asserting that people were afraid of looters and had no protection. After hearing this, the governor had dispatched 125 guardsmen to the Manassas area to deter looting. They were later supplemented by U.S. Marines, as well as Army reserves from Philadelphia and New Jersey. Looting and sightseer problems occurred in Manassas and elsewhere in the state. I talk about this in some depth in the book. In fact, what you'll find is when you saw some of these boats that were tied up to the second story of windows in Manassas, some of those boats were looters pulling up to those houses to get inside. Now, June 22nd was a particularly difficult day in all of Northern Virginia. Even relatively small streams would greatly exceed their prior records for peak discharge. Goose Creek near Leesburg by twice as much, Difficult Run near Great Falls by 5 times as much, Cedar Run near Catlin in Fauquier County by 5.5 times, Cub Run near Centerville by 6 times, and Bull Run in Manassas by 6 times. Now, sometime between the late morning and early afternoon on June 22nd, the 94-year-old one-lane Route 123 bridge in the town of Occoquan succumbed. Now, some of you might know the story of this bridge. So this bridge was built in 1878. It was a one-lane bridge that brought Route 123 down the north bank of the Occoquan River, across the river, into the town of Occoquan, and then Route 123 snaked its way through Occoquan. Now, during the prior, a little bit more than a year, the Virginia Department of Highways had wanted to tear down this bridge. It was carrying about 3,800 cars a day. Their engineers had determined that the bridge was not suited to that, and that the town of Occoquan itself was a bottleneck. In fact, they asserted that this was a type of bridge design that when this bridge goes, it's not going to go gradually, it's going to collapse. And so they wanted it replaced with a bridge on the eastern end of town, where the Route 123 bridge is today. This was fought vociferously and aggressively by the people of the town of Occoquan. So, ironically enough, in the first week of June, a little bit more than 3 weeks before Agnes arrived, Virginia Department of Highways announced, look, costs are rising, the public is against this, we're going to drop this project. Of course, the headlines in the paper say, 94-year-old bridge is saved. 3 weeks later, Agnes took care of that problem. So the bridge succumbs to the floodwaters of Agnes. So also did the filtration plant adjacent to the town, the raw water intake for the plant on the north bank, and the high water service line. And that will be very important for something I'm going to talk about just a little bit later. As waters flooded the low-lying areas along the main street of Occoquan, boats became unmoored from a riverside marina and floated through town, as did coffins from a flooded funeral home. By 4:30, reports arrived in Civil Defense Headquarters noting that 29 men from the Army Corps of Engineers at Fort Belvoir, now these folks had been working incidentally throughout the night in Fairfax and Alexandria, had been sent to sandbag at the Occoquan Dam, over which 10 feet of water continued to flow. Occoquan and Manassas, however, were not the only parts of Prince William to experience trouble. Unremarked in civil defense reports, other tributaries of the Potomac were also threatening life and property in the east and south of the county. Moronsco Creek overflowed its banks, covering part of Route 1, causing the evacuation of a trailer park and the death of 23-year-old Jerry Romans, who was attempting to make a delivery and whose car was overtaken by floodwaters as he attempted to turn around in the trailer park parking lot. Unable to swim, he climbed on top of his car. People heard his shouts but couldn't reach him. His lifeless body was found around 1 a.m. when the waters receded. Another 2 miles south on Route 1, Neabsco Creek flooded over the bridge and swept away 2 vehicles that attempted to cross despite being waved off by flag people. And this you will find occurs a number of times throughout the state, as well as in Prince William and Fairfax counties, but safety personnel would be out there trying to keep people from crossing bridges or from driving through this standing water. And of course, you know, this we sometimes probably all have felt this way. People feel they can make it and they drive their vehicles through and they don't make it. And this happened on Route 1 crossing Neabsco Creek. These folks happened to be rescued. 5 miles farther south, Quantico Creek overflowed its bank, displacing residents along what was then Mine Road. You heard about this community a little earlier, a historic African-American community formerly known as Batestown. Members of the Dumfries Triangle Fire Department traveled throughout the area, assisting with evacuations and aiding people in distress. Councilman Wilmer Porter flooded out of his own home, opened the Dumfries Town Hall for his family and any who needed shelter. Now by June 28th, things were stabilizing in much of the state, but there were 2 regions that were still critical and remained critical until June 24th, Richmond and Northern Virginia. The problem was water, not flood water, but water to drink. Knocking out the water plants at Occoquan disrupted the up to 50 million gallons of water a day that the plants supplied to almost 500,000 people in Northern Virginia. Dumfries and Triangle, incidentally, I should mention, they actually benefited from an emergency hookup to Marine Base Quantico, so they did not have the same problems that were occurring elsewhere in Prince William County in Northern Virginia. Although water emergencies were declared and use restrictions imposed, the problem was that there were simply not enough water tanker trucks in the state to meet the need. So localities had to look out of state. Fairfax County got pumps from Pennsylvania and tanker trucks from Fort Belvoir. Prince William actually got some from Fort Pickett in Virginia. Now, to get the Occoquan water stations back in operation, firefighters and water authority personnel, 75% of whom have been working around the clock since June 21st, worked to pump out the inundated plants and effect repairs. Starting on June 24th with a modest 9 million gallons of water a day from the South Shore plant adjacent to the town of Occoquan, water began to flow again and the water crisis began to recede. Now in the book, I next talk about the recovery and assessment efforts throughout the state. In the town of Occoquan, volunteers were critical to the recovery. VFW Post 7916 on June 22nd helped firemen and sheriff's deputies with traffic and salvage, and the next day set up a canteen to offer refreshments to the National Guard, Army, and other military service members who arrived. In fact, they did such a good job that when the Salvation Army arrived on June 25th, they saw the VFW operation and said, hey, is it okay with you guys if we go elsewhere where people really have the need? Which of course they did. Boy Scouts Explorer First Aid Post 1364 helped out at the Bots Fire Station, and on Saturday, June 25th, Ed Jones, the president of the Civic Association in Lake Ridge, asked Occoquan Mayor Bob Rittenauer what could be done to assist. Rittenauer reportedly said that he needed people to help with cleanup, and after knocking on doors, Jones reportedly arrived with between 70 and 100 men, women, and teenagers to help out the town of Occoquan. But conditions were in fact difficult. County Supervisor Vernon Dawson, who owned a restaurant in town as well as part of a funeral home in another building, when asked what he planned to do, smiled and responded, quote, just say I'm at the 10-yard line and I'm going to punt, end quote. Now, labor for cleanup was to be a source of contention in many parts of the state. Localities sought to use the National Guard for cleanup duty, contrary to state policy. While the situation was still critical, in fact, in some parts of the state on June 23rd, General McCadden of the Virginia National Guard reminded everyone that Guard troops, quote, would not be assigned to any area for the purpose of debris removal or cleanup. This is a policy statement, exclamation point, end quote. An annoyed Governor Holton later through a spokesperson allegedly forcefully asserted, quote, we're not in the cleanup business and we're not going to go into it, end quote. Local Guard units were shortly supposed to go to their annual 2-week summer training in New York, but a number of them attempted to get out of it by petitioning to do their 2 weeks locally doing debris cleanup. You can imagine why they would want to do this. Manassas had one such unit who routed their petition to Richmond through the Chamber of Commerce. This was not well received and was rejected by the governor, and Guard operations were closed down the next day in Prince William. Prince William also participated in the typhoid vaccine controversy. Turns out that health departments throughout the state wanted to get typhoid vaccine for folks because of the flooding. Both federal and state policy said typhoid vaccines were not necessary in these circumstances and told people not to do it. Well, Prince William County performed 3,000 inoculations by June 26 and in fact required rescue workers to get inoculated for typhoid. Now this was happening all over the state and the state officials were really ticked off about it. So they started to bring, if you look at their memos back and forth, they're very angry about this. They try to bring down the hammer. And then later during the recovery efforts, when the Small Business Administration people are coming down to set up their assistance offices, they say they won't come down unless they get inoculated for typhoid. So there's a memo where the state health department says, okay, have them come to our office at 9:30 on Saturday morning and basically don't tell anybody. So that's the sort of thing that occurred. Now by June 27th, federal disaster assistance centers were open in Richmond, Alexandria, Covington, Fredericksburg, Lynchburg, Manassas, Salem, Scottsville, and Waynesboro. Under the Federal Disaster Relief Act of 1970, these were supposed to be one-stop shops for federal and state aid from SBA, HUD, USDA, and the Virginia Employment Commission. After-action reports indicate that there was a great deal of frustration about these between state and federal officials. You can imagine how this works, folks, is you don't have these people, at the federal level, you don't have these people on staff, right? When a disaster occurs, all of a sudden, you're hiring a bunch of people who you're sending down without training to try to process these forms and other things. So this was a source of a lot of consternation. Unfortunately, one type of aid most people would not see was an insurance payment. Although the National Flood Insurance Program went into effect in 1968, it required localities to adopt certain land use and flood protection regulations. Even where this was done, few people purchased the insurance. In fact, in the DC area, it was estimated that only about 10% of the damages would be covered due to low participation. Arlington and Fairfax counties, as well as the cities of Fairfax and Alexandria, all qualified, but there were only 177 policy holders in all of Northern Virginia. 71 of those were in the Arlandria region of Alexandria. One of the most heavily damaged areas in the state. So again, Richmond and Prince William County were the most heavily damaged in the state. Prince William had never even applied for eligibility. A few weeks after Agnes, officials reported that the county attorney was trying to determine what was necessary to participate. In assessing the local aftermath in Prince William County, the local newspaper characterized the response, officials, organizations, and the county's people as marvelous, but it also noted duplication, a lack of coordination, and most troublingly, difficulty getting accurate information. Citing in particular rumors about dams breaking, roads and bridges failing, and the need to boil drinking water. While its death toll was far less than that of Camille, Agnes far outstripped Camille in terms of damage. And I go through some of the damage details in the book. Other damages would take some time to manifest themselves. One of these would be attributable to the impact caused by massive amounts of fresh water flowing down Virginia's rivers into the marine estuaries. This affected the Virginia oyster industry. In fact, the threat to the shellfish industry as a result of Agnes led at the end of July to the limited disaster declarations for 20 Virginia counties and cities, among them coastal plain counties and cities that had not been affected at all by Agnes otherwise. Nationally, Agnes would also have a significant impact, with Pennsylvania being the hardest hit. This is Wilkes-Barre, which got slammed, as some of you might know. And nationally, it was a contentious time. The Vietnam War continued, and just days before Agnes arrived on June 17th, the Watergate break-in occurred. Now, the failure of the federal response in Pennsylvania generated protests, and even then, President Nixon saw an opportunity to secure Pennsylvania in the 1972 election a few months hence. He lost Pennsylvania in 1968. He scapegoated and sacked his HUD secretary, George Romney, who was operating under the constraints of the Disaster Relief Act of 1970. He signed the Agnes Recovery Act of 1972 that incorporated provisions he had opposed for years, allegedly saying that this was, quote, a sure thing in Pennsylvania, unquote. He put his own deputy director and Scranton native Frank Carlucci in charge of the Agnes efforts, and Carlucci moved into a trailer in Wilkes-Barre, winning over the people. After securing victory in 1972 in the presidential election and winning Pennsylvania, Nixon ordered the recall of Carlucci, who left in December, and then he began, of course, restricting and rolling back the Agnes benefits. Now, long-term, Agnes generated a variety of disaster response reforms that played an important role in professionalizing the emergency management of disasters. It was in 1978, after consultation with Carlucci, that President Jimmy Carter consolidated federal disaster response activities in FEMA. I won't say much about this, but pre-Agnes things were a little bit contentious in Prince William County too. This was the era of the 4 horsemen and the 3 mules, for those of you who remember that time. There was some respite after Agnes. Fight had gone out in the town of Occoquan regarding the building of a new Route 123 bridge, and by the middle of August, a temporary H-10 Army bridge was put up, and then a year later, a new bridge at the other end of town was half done. More than a dozen businesses got federal relief, and within a year, most were operating at pre-flood levels. But in September 1975, Eloise came through, generating flash flooding from the stream. The county provided some money to fix the town's drainage system, but the town struggled to find the rest. And the goodwill generated when Lake Ridge volunteers came to Occoquan during Agnes dissipated as residents blamed the recurring stream flooding on inadequately planned development in Lake Ridge. Some businesses had enough and closed up. A few years later, town residents were before the Board of County Supervisors complaining about, quote, flood ridge, unquote. Elsewhere in PWC a year later, Bull Run and other streams remained choked with debris and periodically flooded, but funding was available for a remediation project. Dumfries planned to clean and straighten Quantico Creek. Near Manassas, officials removed the bridge in Ben Lomond Park that was blamed for contributing to the flooding of the Sudley subdivision. County government took action against the sales of flood-damaged cars. This was a problem throughout the state. People started selling their used cars and not revealing that they had been flood damaged. County also took action against contractors who were trying to take advantage of people who needed repairs. Most importantly, perhaps, Prince William County adopted the regulations to qualify for the National Flood Insurance Program, and by a year later, 282 people had procured the insurance. Now, I'll end here with the deaths associated with Hurricane Agnes. I encourage you, if you do read the book, to look at Appendix 2. The reported deaths range from 12 to 17. I was able to decipher, I think, pretty definitively why there was this range. Some people just made mistakes. Some reports, for example, would include the first and last name of an individual as one person, and then the middle name and last name of the same individual as another person. So that was one problem in some sources. Another was that some sources appear to be talking about Virginia, people who lived in Virginia, not the people who died in Virginia. Others, of course, talked about all the people who died in Virginia. Some excluded minors, some did not. So it appears very, very clear to me there were 15 deaths in Prince William County, perhaps 2 more children that were whose names were never reported. I was able to track down the death certificates of those folks. 9 of the deaths occurred in Northern Virginia, and 4 occurred in Prince William or involved Prince William residents. I'll leave you with this. This is in the epigraph and epilogue of the book. These are 2 quotes about 200 years apart, essentially saying the same thing about hurricanes. On June 23rd, down in Richmond, June 23rd of 1972, the director of NOAA, Dr. Robert White, said, quote, "We may have the most modern technology, but when nature goes on a rampage, we are its prisoners." 200 years earlier, roughly, William Beckford, reacting to the Jamaica hurricane of 1780, wrote, quote, "It serves as a scourge to correct the vanity, to humble the pride, and to chastise the imprudence and arrogance of man." End quote. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'll do my best to answer any questions you have in the remaining few minutes, if you do have any. Yes, Marvin.
Oh, okay. The Susquehanna River in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. No, that was hard hit. I think they put City Island underwater. But the modern day Greece that goes over it, right? The undergirdings, if you're at the lower level, has the markings, you know, the high water mark of Agnes hit here. And I'm wondering, if you have anything in your book, are there any structures around here, bridges, tall bridges or structures around here that maybe have the markings? They're like an historical marker.
Yeah, so
say Agnes reached here.
Yeah, so if you, in the book, you will see that I talk about a bunch of different communities in Virginia. Some, like in Scottsville, for example, actually have these pillars where they have all the different all the different floods and their levels, and Agnes is up at the highest level, and they have the dates. Many of these communities, of course, are built along rivers or along old canals, and of course, they repeatedly get flooded. I do talk in the book in the aftermath section about Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania does get slammed, and it's really what changes the national conversation about disasters. The governor of Pennsylvania at the time, Milton Shapp, actually had to be evacuated from his home by rowboat.
Oh yeah, the governor's mansion is right on the Susquehanna.
Right, so that's what I mean, the governor's mansion. Charlie.
So Occoquan's getting an upgrade to its stormwater system now. Does your stormwater system date from this Agnes event?
So, partly. So the stormwater system that Charlie's talking about in Occoquan, actually, the main thing we'll be repairing dates to the winter of 1933, 1934, and was a Civil Works Administration project, which some of you might know was a Roosevelt New Deal project that only lasted about 3 months during that winter and was designed to put people to work. So that initially built this stormwater system that we have that Bailey-Watt Creek feeds into. It was messed up not only during Agnes, but then messed up when Eloise came through in 1975. And it was after Eloise that the county provided some of the money to fix that, but of course the contract ended up being for more than the county had provided, and the town had trouble getting the additional funds. There have been some repairs on it since then, but really, I would say the last major repairs were probably in 1975. Anyone else? Yeah,
You must have been asking yourself this question while you were writing the book. What would happen now if we had a hurricane come through? And of course, it's dependent upon the actions of the state, the county,
right.
and you as mayor. Are you optimistic that we could survive?
Yeah, so here are the advantages we have now. First of all, our predictive ability is much better. So, and I would say, I can tell you this as in my experience as mayor of Occoquan, flooding from the Occoquan River is not the issue for us. We literally know, between Fairfax Water and what others are telling us, we can pretty much predict days ahead of time when that is going to happen. What is unpredictable is flash flooding from inland streams. So when I was joking about Lake Bridge, that Bailey-Watt Creek, for example, that's the problem. We have not in the past been able to predict that. Now, I will tell you, in terms of civil defense responses and emergency action personnel, the real advantage we have, which they did not have at this time, was we have cell phones and other means of communication where we can get information quickly. Our gauges are all electronic, so you don't have to wait, you don't have to go out there to the river, look at the rain gauge, try to wipe for me anyway, wipe your reading glasses off, read the gauge, write it down on something that's going to survive the rain, and get to a phone where the line hasn't been wiped out. We don't have to do any of those sort of things anymore. So communication technology is really one of the things that's made it much easier to respond. Even in earlier times, imagine when you're trying to predict a hurricane. In order to do it, there had to be ships out there that not only were in or near the hurricane, but they had to be in communication with the shore and know who to communicate with at the shore. Those were all tremendous, and then that information had to be consolidated, analyzed, and retransmitted. 3 hours passed, community's already been wiped out by a hurricane by the time you get that information. We don't have that problem now. What we are gonna have problems with over time, though, is the increasing number and frequency, I think, of these things. Like when I mentioned the hurricane hitting the west coast of California, climate change is just gonna create more and more of this, so we're gonna have to be prepared for that. Anyone else? Okay, thank you very much, folks.